notion of horror's final girl is one that's been around for decades. It's a title awarded to the last surviving target of some monster or murderer, usually one who's managed to outlive all of her friends and family. When it comes to overplayed horror tropes, few can match the concept of the final girl. Synonymous with, but not exclusive to, the slasher subgenre, the final girl tends to start off meek and mild-mannered before ultimately finding the new edge needed to take down the enemy at long last. Whilst even casual film fans fawn over Laurie Strode or Sidney Prescott, there are still so many other final girls who just don't get the praise and respect that they deserve. Now, that's not to take anything away from Laurie or Sid, it's just that credit is due elsewhere too. So why don't we now take a moment of appreciation for the underdogs? I'm Amy from What Culture, and here are the 10 best horror movie final girls nobody talks about. 10. Cameron, Last Girl Standing. 2016's Last Girl Standing is a genuinely interesting film that's gone under the radar of many a horror hound. Taking the very concept of the final girl and exploring what happens once the cameras stop rolling, Last Girl Standing shows the impact that squaring off with a masked maniac can have on someone. As the movie opens, main character Cameron and her friends are brutalized by your classic masked killer. Whilst Cameron's friends all unfortunately end up as further notches on this murderer's body count bedpost, she manages to escape with her life intact. Years later, we find Cameron living a life of paranoid solitude, spending all her time alone in her apartment or in quiet seclusion at her job at a laundromat. She's suspicious of everyone and is riddled with flashbacks of her trauma. In a landscape where the idea of the final girl is all about surviving whatever terrifying threat is rearing its head, regardless of whatever personal toll that takes, Last Girl Standing jumps out as something pretty unique in the horror genre, seeing what happens beyond those final screen moments and the mess that ensues. If not for anything else, Cameron deserves some credit for showing us something new. 9. Charlie, 31. Rob Zombie's 31 is a movie that definitely split opinion upon its release back in 2016. It really took grimy, gruesome, and grotesque to levels way above what had already been seen in the director's carnage-laden House of a Thousand Corpses or The Devil's Rejects. However, it did offer up two powerhouse performances: Sherry Moon as protagonist Charlie and Richard Brake as the terrifying, if not stupidly named, villain Doomhead. Thrust into the confines of the ominously titled murder world, Charlie's forced to battle through increasingly violent levels. The only way to survive murder world is to kill all in front of you or just pray that you make it through to when the murderous game's timer expires. Having managed to survive the onslaught of crazed clowns, chainsaw-wielding rednecks, Harley Quinn-styled femme fatales, and a rogue Nazi, Charlie's final confrontation with Doomhead is a battle for the ages. The woman deserves some credit at least for getting through such a range of killers in a relatively short time, surely making her more than suitable for the prestigious final girl acclaim. 8. Maggie Severance. While many are turned off instantly by anything involving Danny Dyer, the cheeky white boy does have some great movies on his CV. Well, by the time of its release in 2006, some people were so sick of Dyer and his overplayed shtick that they instantly binned any movie he was in. However, for those that checked out Severance, they were in for a treat. Not only was Danny Dyer relatively palatable, but the film itself was a bloody comedy horror that made for a brisk, enjoyable watch. Basically, on a work retreat gone wrong, a group of colleagues are murdered one by one in gruesome, brutal ways. Eventually, the only people left are Danny Dyer's Steve and Laura Harris's Maggie, and God knows Maggie has to do a lot of the heavy lifting. Whilst Steve was there mainly to bring the laughs and some levity to the proceedings, it was left to Maggie to work her way through a maze of maniacs carrying knives, guns, and flamethrowers. The fact that this duo survived the insane situation they find themselves in is largely down to the smarts and willpower of Maggie. Well, I mean that and the two conveniently placed escorts carrying shotguns. 7. Sarah Carter, The Descent. One popular ingredient in the common final girl recipe is the aspect of vengeance. This can be taking down the boogeyman that once stalked them, avenging the loss of a loved one, or in the case of The Descent's Sarah Carter, leaving your dead husband's Halloween's mistress to die in a dark cave filled with savage monsters. Really? Good for her. I mean, what would you have done? For some context, Sarah is still grieving the loss of her hubby and young daughter who died in a car crash. An old friend convinces her to come on a group caving trip as a way to take her mind off things. Unfortunately, said cave is riddled with blind, flesh-devouring beasts known as crawlers. When the group of friends is whittled down to just Sarah and Juno, the woman who had an affair with Sarah's husband and is suggested as being partly to blame for his car crash, Sarah simply pikes Juno's leg with a pickaxe and leaves her to die before escaping herself. The thing is, Sarah's fate and status as a final girl is dependent on which version of the descent you watch. The US version ends with Sarah escaping the cave and making it to safety, whereas the UK cut of the picture sees that escape rendered as a hallucination, with Sarah instead trapped in the cave whilst the crawlers circle in on her. 6. Mia Allen, Evil Dead. The pantheon of horror is one mostly brimming with awful, needless remakes or reboots. Every now and then, though, there's a do-over that shines bright, and one such beacon of hope is Fede Alvarez's 2013 Evil Dead. In a remote woodland cabin, a group of friends hole up to support one of their own through heroin withdrawal. After reading an incantation from a suspicious book they found in the basement, an evil is unleashed that possesses Jane Levy's Mia Allen, repositioning her as the villain for much of the film. After Mia causes carnage amongst the group, she is eventually killed off and revived by her brother, ending the film as the only surviving member of the cabin crew swinging a chainsaw and rocking a severed hand. When the film rolls to a close with Mia as the only survivor of the Evil Dead, audiences are left with something rarely associated with remakes and reboots: an actual want to see more, particularly with the final shot tease of Bruce Campbell's Ashley J. Williams joining the fray alongside Mia Allen. 5. Rachel Carruthers, Halloween 4: The Return of Michael Myers. When people think of the Halloween franchise, the obvious final girl that comes to mind is Laurie Strode. However, the Halloween series also served up another fantastic final girl in the shape of Rachel Carruthers. As the foster sister of Jamie Lloyd, the niece of Michael, Rachel has to fight tooth and nail to protect the youngster from the grasp of her murderous uncle. Halloween 4 is probably one of the better entries to the Halloween franchise, and it's a movie often remembered for its striking final shot of a blood-stained Jamie having attacked her foster mother with a pair of scissors, seemingly following in Michael's footsteps. Away from that, the oft underappreciated star of the show is Rachel, and her iron will to shield Jamie whatever the cost. Unfortunately though, despite making it to the final girl realms in this flick, Rachel is killed off within mere minutes of the follow-up picture, Halloween 5: The Revenge of Michael Myers. 4. Kristin Parker, A Nightmare on Elm Street 3: Dream Warriors. Much like the situation with Rachel Carruthers and the Halloween series, it's hard to stand out as a great final girl when the franchise already has a mainstay staple leading the charge. Whilst Rachel had the shadow of Laurie Strode looming large, so too did the Elm Street franchise's Kristin Parker have the presence of Nancy Thompson to contend with. Appearing in A Nightmare on Elm Street 3: Dream Warriors, the Patricia Arquette-played Kristin was yet another disposable teen that Freddy Krueger had bad plans for. The only difference with Kristin, though, was that she had the ability to bring other people into her dreams to help battle Krueger. When all was said and done, it was Kristin who was left standing tall, with even franchise fave Nancy perishing at the hands of Krueger here. Moving forward, it seemed that Kristin Parker was to be the one to lead the franchise in place of Nancy Thompson, but in classic franchise style, she was killed off in the very next movie. 3. Sarah, The Binding. While the horror world has rightfully been abuzz with the religious-leaning brilliance of St. Maud in recent months, one other similarly faith-based effort is 2016's The Binding. Whilst it may not quite match the high quality at play with St. Maud, The Binding is a solid movie in its own right. Basically, Sarah and Bram are a married couple who are majorly religious, and live their life completely by the good book. Things take a turn for the insane when Bram receives a visit from God, telling him the family's infant daughter will usher in the apocalypse and the only way to stop this is by killing her. As the film explores whether this is really God or something demonic or maybe even mental illness, Sarah is pushed to her limits and somewhat becomes the final girl of this story, having to play the protective mother, the tormented victim, and also the supportive wife. Actress Amy Gumenick puts in a marvellous turn as Sarah, portraying a range of emotions throughout and highlighting the ultimate showing of faith and trust as she finds herself forced into an impossible position. 2. Kirsty Cotton, Hellraiser. When discussing great horror antagonists and franchises, it's not uncommon for Pinhead and Hellraiser to get a mention. He and his franchise often don't get quite as much love as their peers, however, and likewise, longtime Hellraiser heroine Kirsty Cotton doesn't get as much praise and adoration as other final girls around her level. From trying to rescue her father from hell to using Pinhead and the Cenobites for her own means, Kirsty's appearances across the Hellraiser franchise proved her to be a relentless, determined figure who grew to be far more than just the standard stock character seen in so many other horror offerings. Instead, the Hellraiser series showed great character depth and growth for Kirsty, and it's a crying shame how she usually gets overlooked when looking at the great heroines of the genre. 1. Sue Snell, Carrie. Sue Snell is a pretty interesting example of this trope, being a reformed bad egg who ultimately ends up as the final girl of the Stephen King adaptation, Carrie. Played by Amy Irving in Brian De Palma's 1976 flick, Sue is someone who initially takes great pleasure in seeing poor Carrie White bullied and ridiculed. As the film's opening plays out, Sue is one of those laughing at Carrie during the movie's famed shower scene. Unlike the others though, she begins to feel remorse for the mocking of young White, to the point that she makes a sincere gesture of having her boyfriend Tommy accompany Carrie to prom. Of course, this prom would go on to become known as the Black Prom, with sissy SpaceX Carrie raining down glorious telekinetic revenge on her tormentors. For Sue, she's the only person left alive as the picture comes to a close, with her friends, classmates, and teachers all gifted a spicy, fiery death. What makes Sue a particularly noteworthy final girl is that the events of Carrie saw her fully change her life, to the point that she's a school guidance counsellor by the time of The Rage, Carrie 2, where she goes on to help support Carrie's half-sister. And with that, we've reached the end of this list of the 10 best horror movie final girls nobody talks about. If you can think of any more underrated final girls, then let us know in the comments down below. And as always, remember to check out whatculture.com for more lists and articles like this every single day. I've been Amy from What Culture, and I'll catch you on the flip side.